She wasn't supposed to open it. Clara Hayes had spent years blending into the background, just a plus-sized waitress working late shifts at a quiet roadside diner, surviving on tips and avoiding attention. So when a wealthy, intimidating man left behind a leather briefcase, she did what she always did. She returned it. No questions, no curiosity, just did the right thing. But something felt off. The briefcase was too heavy, too carefully locked, too important. She shouldn't have looked inside, but she did. And what she found wasn't money. It was evidence. Names, accounts, secrets powerful enough to destroy entire families. By the time she reached his office to return it, he already knew she had seen it. And the most dangerous man in the city wasn't angry. He was interested, because the quiet waitress who should have walked away was the only person who didn't run. That night, Clara Hayes stopped being invisible. And the life she knew ended. Before we get into the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I would like to see how far this story reaches. Also, subscribe to Mr. Mafia Boss for more sizzling, action-packed romance Mafia Boss stories. Now let's continue. The bell above the diner door jingled at 11:40, which meant trouble, because nobody good ever walked into Ruthie's diner that late on a Tuesday. Clara Hayes looked up from wiping down the counter, taking in the man who had just stepped through the door. Tall, dark hair, slightly disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He carried himself like a man used to rooms clearing when he entered them. He didn't look like Ruthie's usual clientele. Truckers, night shift workers, the occasional lost tourist. Not men in tailored charcoal suits who moved like they were used to being obeyed. "Table for one," he said, his voice low and clipped, not quite a request. "Anywhere you like," Clara said, gesturing at the mostly empty diner. "We're not exactly turning people away tonight." He chose the booth in the back corner, the one with a clear view of both the door and the parking lot. Clara had waited enough tables in her life to recognize that particular habit. Men who sat facing exits weren't usually accountants. She brought him coffee he didn't ask for and a menu he barely glanced at. "Just the coffee," he said, "and whatever's fastest." "Meatloaf special's been sitting under the heat lamp since 6, Clara said. "I wouldn't recommend it unless you enjoy regret." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close enough to notice. "Grilled cheese, then." "Now that I can promise won't kill you." He didn't respond, already pulling his phone from his jacket and typing something with quick, sharp movements. Clara left him to it, retreating behind the counter to fill ketchup bottles and half listened to Ruthie complain about the ice machine again. The man ate quickly, distracted, his eyes darting to the door every few minutes, like he was expecting someone or something. He paid in cash, left a tip generous enough to make Clara do a double take, and left just as abruptly as he'd arrived. She didn't think about him again until she was clearing his table 20 minutes later and found the briefcase. It sat wedged against the wall beneath the booth. Black leather, expensive looking, the kind of thing that belonged in an office with a view rather than a roadside diner off Highway 9. She almost missed it entirely, the dim lighting near the back booths doing nothing to help visibility. "Ruthie," Clara called toward the kitchen. "That guy in the suit left something." Ruthie appeared in the pass-through window, drying her hands on a stained apron. "The one who tipped $40 on a grilled cheese?" "That's the one." "Well, don't just stand there gawking at it. Chase him down." Clara hefted the briefcase, surprised by its weight, far heavier than it should have been for something that size. She hurried to the door, scanning the parking lot, but the sleek black car that had been idling near the entrance when he arrived was already gone, taillights disappearing around the bend in the road. "Damn it," she muttered, stepping back inside. "No luck?" Ruthie asked. "He's gone, long gone." Clara set the briefcase on the counter, studying the brass clasps, the small monogrammed initials near the handle. "DR. Well, somebody's going to be missing that pretty badly." Ruthie said. "You want me to lock it up in the office safe till he comes back." Clara ran her thumb along the leather, something about the weight of it nagging at her attention. It wasn't just heavy, it was substantial in a way that suggested more than paperwork or a laptop. "I'll take it home," she said. "If he calls looking for it, we'll know where to send him." Ruthie shrugged, already turning back toward the kitchen. "Your funeral, sweetheart. Something tells me a man who tips like that doesn't misplace things by accident." Clara barely heard her, already carrying the briefcase toward her locker in the back room. Her curiosity, the same curiosity that had gotten her into trouble more times than she cared to admit throughout her 28 years, already beginning to whisper questions she knew she shouldn't be asking. What was inside something that heavy, that carefully locked, left behind by a man who looked like he'd rather die than misplace his car keys? She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she'd return it exactly as she found it, untouched, unopened, the responsible thing any decent person would do. She almost believed herself. By the time her shift ended at midnight, the briefcase sat in the passenger seat of her ancient sedan, riding home with her through the dark, quiet streets, and Clara couldn't stop glancing at it every few seconds, like it might do something unexpected. It didn't. It just sat there, heavy with secrets she had absolutely no business wanting to uncover. The briefcase sat on Clara's kitchen table for exactly 40 minutes before she gave in. She had tried to ignore it. She had made tea, scrolled through her phone, even attempted to watch 20 minutes of some forgettable sitcom rerun, but her eyes kept drifting back to the black leather case sitting innocently beside her fruit bowl, taunting her with everything she didn't know. "This is a terrible idea," she said out loud to her empty apartment, which didn't argue back. The locks were the kind that required a code, small brass dials set into the clasps, and under normal circumstances, that should have been the end of it. Clara had no business trying to guess a stranger's combination. Except the clasps weren't fully engaged. She noticed it while running her thumb along the edge, feeling for weak points out of pure curiosity, and found that one of the latches had never quite caught, likely jostled loose during the drive home. It popped open with barely any pressure at all. Clara stared at the gap, her heart rate ticking up several notches. "Don't," she told herself firmly. "Just close it. Lock it back up. Call it a night." She didn't close it. Instead, her fingers found the second latch, and with a soft click, the whole case fell open across her kitchen table, revealing exactly nothing like what she had expected. No laptop. No paperwork for some boring corporate merger. Instead, thick manila folders filled the interior, each one labeled with names she didn't recognize, dates spanning back several years, and beneath them, a leather ledger with columns of numbers that made her breath catch even before she understood what she was looking at. She should have stopped there. She knew that with absolute certainty, even as her hand reached for the first folder. The papers inside detailed financial transactions, offshore accounts, numbers with more zeros than Clara had ever seen attached to a single figure in her entire life. Wire transfers, property deeds, and interspersed among the financial records, photographs, grainy surveillance shots of men in dark suits meeting in parking garages, warehouses, the back rooms of restaurants that looked considerably nicer than Ruthie's diner. One name appeared repeatedly across multiple documents, highlighted in yellow marker like someone had been building a case. Vincent Marchetti. Clara didn't recognize the name, but something about the careful documentation, the methodical evidence gathering, made her stomach twist with unmistakable dread. This wasn't a briefcase full of business paperwork. This was evidence. The kind of evidence people built when they were trying to expose someone or protect themselves from someone, or both. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped to the next folder, finding surveillance photos of a man she didn't recognize, meeting privately with someone identified in handwritten notes, only as Dr. Second. The photographs showed money changing hands, a briefcase similar to the one now sitting on her kitchen table, passed between two men in what looked unmistakably like a betrayal, captured on film. Clara sat back hard in her chair, her pulse hammering now. Dr. The same initials, monogrammed on the briefcase handle. Dominic Rossi, she guessed, though she had no way to confirm it, no context for who exactly he was, or why he was carrying around evidence of what appeared to be someone close to him working against his interests. She should call the police. That was the obvious answer, the responsible answer, the thing any sensible person would do upon discovering evidence of what looked like organized criminal activity in a briefcase that didn't belong to them. Except something told her, some instinct sharpened by years of watching the world carefully from behind diner counters, that the police weren't going to be the right answer here. Not with numbers like these, not with the kind of careful, deliberate evidence gathering spread across her kitchen table. This was mafia business, the kind of thing that got people killed for knowing too much. And she had just spent 20 minutes reading through every page like it was a novel she couldn't put down. Clara closed the ledger with hands that had stopped trembling and started shaking outright, her mind racing through everything she now knew and couldn't unknow. Somewhere out there, a man named Dominic Rossi was probably realizing his briefcase was missing, probably retracing his steps back to a roadside diner off Highway 9. And when he found her, when he realized she had seen exactly what was inside, there would be no pretending she hadn't. She thought about her father, gone 8 years now, and the strange, careful way he used to talk about certain business associates from his old job at the shipping yards. Names he never fully explained, warnings he gave her that she'd always dismissed as an old man's paranoia. Vincent Marchetti. The name tugged at something buried in her memory, something she couldn't quite place, but that sent a cold thread of unease curling through her stomach regardless. She closed the briefcase, latching it carefully back exactly as she'd found it, though she knew with absolute certainty that closing it now meant nothing. She had already seen too much, and by morning she would have to decide whether to walk into whatever world this briefcase belonged to and hand it back, knowing exactly what she carried, or disappear entirely and hope that would be enough to keep her safe. Neither option felt like it would end well. The Rossi Shipping and Logistics building sat in the heart of the financial district, 40 stories of glass and steel that made Clara feel like an ant the moment she stepped out of her rusted sedan into the shadow of it. She had spent most of the night deciding whether to come here at all. Calling the police had crossed her mind a dozen times, but every scenario she ran through ended the same way. Her, alone, trying to explain evidence of organized crime to officers who might or might not already be compromised by whatever network the ledger implicated. She had grown up around enough of her father's old warnings to know that some things existed outside the reach of normal channels. So she had wrapped the briefcase in an old towel, placed it carefully in her passenger seat like it might detonate, and driven downtown with her hands locked at 10 and 2 the entire way. The lobby alone was more intimidating than anywhere Clara had ever set foot. Marble floors, a security desk manned by 2 men who looked like they moonlighted as linebackers, and an elevator bank that required a key card she obviously didn't possess. "Can I help you?" one of the security guards asked, his tone polite, but his eyes doing a quick, assessing sweep of her worn cardigan and scuffed shoes that made it clear exactly what conclusion he'd already drawn. "I need to see Mr. Rossi," Clara said, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. "It's about something he lost. Mr. Rossi doesn't take walk-in appointments. He'll want to see me," Clara said, lifting the briefcase slightly. "Tell him someone's returning his property." The guard's eyes flicked to the case, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition or concern that he covered quickly with practiced neutrality. "Wait here!" He stepped away, murmuring into a radio clipped to his shoulder, and Clara stood in the middle of that vast marble lobby, feeling smaller than she had in years, acutely aware of every worn thread in her cardigan, every scuff on her shoes that had never mattered before but suddenly felt like a spotlight highlighting exactly how out of place she was. The guard returned 2 minutes later, his expression carefully blank. 38th floor. Someone will meet you at the elevator." The ride up felt endless. Her reflection staring back at her from the polished elevator doors, pale and nervous, despite her best efforts to project calm. When the doors finally slid open, a woman in a sharp black suit was waiting, her expression unreadable. "This way," the woman said, already turning down a hallway lined with dark wood and abstract art that probably cost more than Clara's entire apartment building. They passed several offices, glass-walled and occupied by people who barely glanced up from their work, before reaching a set of heavy double doors at the end of the hall. The woman knocked once, then pushed the door open without waiting for a response. "She's here," the woman said, then stepped aside to let Clara through before closing the door behind her. Dominic Rossi sat behind a desk large enough to seat 6 people comfortably, his attention fixed on a laptop screen that he didn't look up from immediately. The office itself was exactly what Clara expected, and nothing like it at the same time. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, minimal furniture, everything precisely placed with the kind of deliberate control that suggested a man who left nothing to chance. Except, apparently, his briefcase. "You're the waitress," he said finally, looking up, his sharp eyes taking her in with the same calculating assessment she remembered from the diner, though something in his expression had shifted, sharpened into something more focused. "Clara," she said, "Clara Hayes, and you're missing this." She set the briefcase down on the edge of his desk, the sound of leather against polished wood echoing louder than it should have in the tense silence of the room. Dominic's gaze dropped to the case, then rose back to her face, studying her with an intensity that made her want to fidget, despite years of practice keeping her composure under difficult customers. "Do you know how many people would have kept that?" he said slowly, "or sold it, or simply disappeared with the contents, rather than driving downtown to hand it back personally?" "I imagine quite a few," Clara said, "but that's not really my style." "No," Dominic said, something almost thoughtful in his tone now. "I don't imagine it is." He stood, rounding the desk with unhurried steps, and Clara had to fight the instinct to back away as he approached, stopping close enough that she caught the faint scent of expensive cologne mixed with something colder underneath, the smell of a man who dealt in dangerous things and had long since stopped being afraid of them. "Did you open it?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct, and Clara understood with sudden clarity that everything happening next depended entirely on how she answered. She thought about lying. It would have been easy, would have been safer probably, to claim she'd found it locked and untouched, returned it out of pure civic duty, without a single curious glance inside. But something about the way Dominic Rossi watched her, patient and unblinking, told her he already knew the answer before she gave it. "Yes," she said, "I opened it." Something flickered across his face, too quick to fully read, gone before she could name it. "Then we have quite a lot to discuss," he said quietly. "Sit down, Miss Hayes." Clara sat in the chair across from Dominic's desk, her back straight despite the anxiety twisting through her stomach, refusing to let her posture betray the fear she absolutely felt. Dominic didn't sit immediately. He circled behind his desk slowly, retrieving the briefcase and setting it in front of him, though he didn't open it. His eyes remained fixed on Clara the entire time, studying her with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and nothing to lose by waiting. "You could have called the police," he said finally, settling into his chair. "Anonymous tip. Evidence of financial crimes left on someone's doorstep. It would have been simple. I thought about it. But you didn't." "No. Why not?" Clara considered her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said next would shape everything that happened after this conversation. "Because I grew up around enough of my father's old business associates to know that some things don't stay buried when they should. Calling the police felt like handing a lit match to someone and hoping they'd know better than to start a fire." Something shifted in Dominic's expression, sharp interest replacing the careful neutrality he'd maintained since she walked in. "Your father was in shipping." It wasn't a question. Clara's stomach tightened. You know that already. I make it a habit to know everything about anyone who walks into my building carrying evidence of my organization's internal problems, Dominic said. Robert Hayes worked the docks for 15 years before his death. Had some interesting associations toward the end of his career. Clara's hands curled into fists in her lap. My father was an honest man. I didn't say he wasn't, Dominic said, his voice carrying no particular judgment, just cold, careful observation. I said he had interesting associations. There's a difference. What does that have to do with any of this? That, Dominic said, tapping one finger against the closed briefcase, is exactly what I intend to find out. Clara's mind raced backward, trying to remember details from documents she'd only glanced at hours ago, names and dates blurring together in her memory. The name in the ledger, Vincent Marchetti. That means something, doesn't it? Dominic went very still. What do you know about Vincent Marchetti? Nothing, Clara admitted, except that name felt familiar somehow, and I can't figure out why. Interesting, Dominic said, though his tone suggested he found it considerably more than merely interesting. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed intensity. What exactly did you see, Miss Hayes? Be specific. Financial records, wire transfers, property deeds with numbers I couldn't begin to comprehend, Clara said, deciding honesty was her only viable path forward, now that lying was clearly off the table. Photographs of meetings in parking garages and warehouses. Someone identified only as your second, meeting privately with people who weren't identified at all, exchanging what looked like a briefcase similar to that one. Dominic's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack in his careful composure since she'd entered the room. You read everything, he said quietly. I read enough to understand it was dangerous, Clara said. Enough to know that someone close to you is working against you, and enough to realize that whoever put together that evidence spent a very long time building a case against people who probably wouldn't hesitate to make problems disappear. You're not wrong, Dominic said. So why? Clara said, some of her natural bluntness finally breaking through the careful caution she'd maintained since walking in. Am I sitting here having a civilized conversation with you, instead of already being one of those problems that disappears? Something almost like amusement flickered across Dominic's face, quick and startling in its unfamiliarity. Because you drove downtown and handed my property back personally instead of running, Miss Hayes. Because you're sitting in my office right now, clearly terrified, and yet you haven't once tried to lie to me or beg for your safety. That tells me something considerably more valuable than fear would. And what's that? That you might actually be useful, Dominic said, rather than simply inconvenient. Clara stared at him, uncertain whether to feel relieved or more alarmed by that particular assessment. Useful how? That remains to be determined, Dominic said, standing again, moving to the window that overlooked the city sprawling out below them. But I find myself with a significant problem, Miss Hayes. Someone inside my organization has been feeding information to a man who represents everything I've spent years trying to eliminate from this city. I have suspicions about who that person might be, but very little concrete proof beyond what apparently sits in that ledger you've already read. You want my help. I want to know exactly how much you understand about what you saw, Dominic said, turning back to face her. Because if you're as observant as you appear to be, you may have noticed details even I haven't fully processed yet. Clara's mind flashed back to the photographs, the careful notations in the margins, details she'd absorbed almost unconsciously in her rush to understand what she was looking at. There was a pattern, she said slowly, the realization forming even as she spoke it aloud. The meetings, they all happened on Thursdays, always at different locations, but always within 2 hours of a specific shipping schedule, like someone was using legitimate business movements as cover for something else entirely. Dominic's expression sharpened considerably, all trace of casual amusement gone now, replaced by something far more focused. Say that again. The dates, Clara said. Every meeting corresponded to a Thursday shipment schedule. Whoever's arranging these meetings has access to your logistics calendar." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, and Clara watched something click into place behind his sharp eyes, pieces of a puzzle rearranging themselves with sudden, terrible clarity. "There are only 4 people with access to that schedule," he said finally, his voice gone dangerously quiet. "Then I suppose you're about to find out which one of them isn't as loyal as you thought," Clara said. Dominic's gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch, something calculating and entirely too interested settling into his expression. "It appears, Miss Hayes," he said slowly, "that returning my briefcase has made you considerably more valuable than I initially anticipated, which also means considerably more dangerous for you to walk away from right now." Clara's stomach dropped. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," Dominic said, "that you're not leaving this building without protection. Not until I understand exactly how much danger you've placed yourself in, simply by being observant." "Protection," Clara repeated, the word tasting strange in her mouth. "You're talking about protection like I've already agreed to whatever this is." "You don't have much choice," Dominic said, returning to his chair with the unhurried calm of a man accustomed to people eventually accepting his version of reality. "The moment you read those files, you became a liability to whoever's been feeding information to Marchetti. That person doesn't know you exist yet. They will, the moment I start asking questions using the details you just gave me. So don't ask the questions." "That's not how this works." Clara pressed her palms against her knees, willing her voice to stay steady. "I have a job, Mr. Rossi. A shift tomorrow at 6 that Ruthie needs covered. An apartment with rent due Friday. I don't have room in my life for whatever this is." "You made room the moment you opened that briefcase," Dominic said, though not unkindly. There was something almost clinical in the way he said it, like he was simply stating a fact rather than delivering a threat. "I'm not asking you to abandon your life, Miss Hayes. I'm telling you that ignoring what's happened won't make it disappear. You could just let me walk away," Clara said. "Pretend I never opened it. Pretend this conversation never happened." Dominic studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes unreadable. "Could I trust you to actually forget what you saw?" "No," Clara admitted, because lying at this point felt not only useless but dangerous. "I don't forget things easily. It's sort of my problem." Something shifted in his expression, the barest flicker of what might have been respect. "Most people would have said yes, would have promised whatever I wanted to hear in order to leave this room as quickly as possible. I'm not most people." "Clearly not," Dominic said. "You walked into a building owned by a man most sane people cross the street to avoid. And instead of groveling or lying, you're sitting there correcting my assumptions about your own trustworthiness. Would you prefer I groveled?" "I would prefer honesty," Dominic said, "which is apparently in shorter supply around me than I realized until about 20 minutes ago." Clara studied him carefully, trying to read past the careful control he maintained, searching for whatever angle he might be working. She'd waited enough tables to recognize when someone was performing charm to extract something, and this didn't feel like that. This felt like genuine, if reluctant, curiosity. "Why does it matter to you," she asked, "whether I lie or not? You clearly have resources to handle this however you want, regardless of what I say." "Because I've spent the last several years surrounded by people who tell me exactly what they think I want to hear," Dominic said, his voice dropping into something quieter, more contemplative. "My captains, my lawyers, even my own family. Everyone calculates their words around me, trying to manage my reactions rather than simply telling me the truth. It becomes exhausting, trying to separate genuine information from strategic performance. And you think I'm different because I told you I opened your briefcase instead of lying about it." "I think," Dominic said slowly, "that you had every reason to lie, every reason to protect yourself with a comfortable fiction, and you chose not to. That tells me something about your character, that 3 years of loyalty from certain members of my own organization apparently couldn't guarantee." The weight of that statement settled between them, heavier than Clara expected. She thought about her father again, his quiet insistence on honesty, even when it cost him, even when lying would have made his life considerably easier during those final difficult years at the shipping yards. "My father used to say the truth was the only thing worth protecting," she said, the words slipping out before she'd fully decided to share them. "He said lies were like debts. Eventually, someone comes to collect, and the interest is always worse than you expected." Dominic's expression sharpened with sudden interest. "Your father sounds like he understood something most people in my world never learn." "He learned it the hard way," Clara said, something bitter creeping into her voice, despite her best efforts to keep it neutral. "Cost him his job eventually. Some disagreement with management over shipments he refused to sign off on without proper documentation. He never fully explained what happened. Just came home one day and said he wasn't going back." "When was this?" "About 8 years ago. He died 3 years after that. Heart attack, according to the doctors, though he'd never had heart problems before that I knew of." Clara paused, something cold moving through her chest as she said the words aloud, connections she'd never quite allowed herself to examine too closely, suddenly feeling less like paranoia and more like buried truth. Dominic went very still, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the hair on her arms rise. "What shipping company did your father work for?" "Coastal Freight and Logistics." "Why?" "Because Coastal Freight and Logistics was acquired by a holding company 8 years ago," Dominic said slowly, "a holding company that, as it happens, has direct ties to Vincent Marchetti." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "That's not possible. My father never mentioned." "Your father may not have known the full extent of who he was dealing with," Dominic said. "Or he may have known exactly enough to make himself a liability the moment he refused to look the other way on something he shouldn't have seen." The room seemed to tilt slightly around Clara, the careful, comfortable narrative she'd built about her father's death for the past 5 years, suddenly cracking apart at the seams. "You're saying someone killed my father?" "I'm saying," Dominic said carefully, "that the pattern you're describing sounds uncomfortably familiar to patterns I've seen before, in my own line of work. I'm not confirming anything without proof, but I think, Miss Hayes, that you and I may have stumbled into something considerably larger and more personal than either of us initially realized." Clara sat frozen, her mind racing through 8 years of assumptions, half-remembered conversations with her father that had never quite made sense, warnings she'd dismissed as an old man's excessive caution. "I need to know," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever this is, whatever connects my father to your ledger, I need to know the truth." Dominic studied her for a long moment, something resolving behind his sharp eyes. "Then it appears," he said quietly, "that our interests have just become considerably more aligned than either of us expected this morning." Dominic opened the briefcase for the first time since Clara had returned it, spreading the contents across his desk with careful, methodical precision. Clara moved around to stand beside him, no longer just a witness dragged into his world, but someone with a personal stake in understanding exactly what these documents contained. "Show me the photograph," Dominic said. "The one with the meeting you mentioned. The exchange." Clara sorted through the folders until she found it. A grainy surveillance shot showing 2 men in a parking garage, briefcase between them, faces partially obscured by shadow. Dominic studied it for a long moment, then pulled a second photograph from a separate folder, one Clara hadn't seen before, and set it beside the first. "Recognize either of these men?" he asked. Clara looked between the 2 photographs. The second showed a clearer image, better lighting, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a distinctive scar along his jaw. Something about the shape of his face, the particular way he held himself, tugged at a memory buried deep enough that it took her several seconds to place it. "That's him," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the man who came to my father's funeral. I remember him standing at the back of the church, never came up to offer condolences, just watched the whole service from a distance and left before anyone could speak to him." Dominic's jaw tightened. "That's Anthony Castellano." My chief operations officer. He's been with my organization for 12 years. 12 years, Clara repeated, the implications settling slowly into place. He's the one leaking information. It appears so, Dominic said, though his voice carried none of the surprise Clara expected, only cold, methodical calculation. Castellano has access to my full logistics schedule. Every shipment, every route, every Thursday transfer you identified earlier. He's precisely positioned to feed Marchetti exactly the kind of operational intelligence that photograph suggests he's been providing. But why would he be at my father's funeral? Dominic pulled another document from the pile, a financial record Clara hadn't examined closely before, columns of numbers with dates spanning back nearly a decade. Because your father worked for Coastal Freight, and Coastal Freight was one of the companies Castellano personally oversaw during the acquisition process 8 years ago. If your father discovered something during that transition, something about how Marchetti's network was using legitimate shipping routes to move product, Castellano would have been the one responsible for making sure that information never surfaced. Clara's hands trembled as she picked up the financial document, scanning the numbers without fully comprehending them, her mind still catching up to the magnitude of what Dominic was suggesting. You think Castellano had my father killed? I think, Dominic said carefully, that your father's death, listed as natural causes with no autopsy requested, following his abrupt departure from a company involved in criminal shipping operations, forms a pattern I've seen executed before. Men who see too much, who refuse to look away, tend to develop sudden, convenient health problems in this business. The room felt too small suddenly, the weight of 8 years of grief and unexamined suspicion crashing down on Clara all at once. She had spent years telling herself her father's death was simply bad luck, cruel timing, nothing more sinister than a heart that had given out too soon. The possibility that someone had orchestrated it, had murdered him and disguised it as natural causes, threatened to buckle her knees entirely. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. Sit down, Dominic said, his voice softer now than she'd heard it since arriving, guiding her toward the chair with a hand at her elbow that felt surprisingly careful given everything else about him. I need proof, Clara said, once she'd settled into the seat, her voice shaking despite her attempt to keep it steady. Real proof, not just suspicion and photographs from a parking garage. I intend to get it, Dominic said. Castellano has been careful for years, which is precisely why I never suspected him until you identified that pattern with the Thursday schedules. But careful men make mistakes when they believe they're no longer being watched. What are you going to do? I'm going to let him believe nothing has changed, Dominic said, his voice dropping into something cold and calculating. I'm going to continue operating exactly as I have, while quietly gathering everything I need to confirm his connection to Marchetti and, if what we're discussing is accurate, his connection to your father's death. And what about me? Dominic's eyes met hers, something unreadable passing across his features. You're the only outside witness whose connected pieces of this puzzle Castellano believes are safely buried, which means, whether either of us wants it or not, you're now part of this investigation, and considerably more exposed than you were this morning. Clara absorbed that, the fear she'd been holding at bay since walking into this building finally catching up with the full weight of everything she now understood. So what happens next? Next, Dominic said, standing and moving toward the door. You don't go home tonight. Not to your apartment, not anywhere Castellano's people might think to look for a waitress who returned my briefcase and happened to notice something she shouldn't have. You're being paranoid. I'm being careful, Dominic corrected. There's a considerable difference, and in my experience, the men who survive long enough to matter are the ones who understand that distinction. Clara studied him, this man she'd known for less than a day, who had just upended 8 years of grief with a single photograph and a working theory about her father's murder. You really believe he was killed because of something to do with this? I believe, Dominic said quietly, that you deserve to know the truth, whatever it turns out to be, and I intend to make sure you live long enough to learn it. The certainty in his voice, cold and absolute, sent a shiver through Clara that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, unsettling realization that the most dangerous man in the city had just made her survival a personal priority. She didn't know yet whether that should terrify her or offer the first real comfort she'd felt in longer than she could remember. Clara didn't sleep that night. Dominic had arranged a car to take her to a secure apartment 2 floors below his own penthouse, insisting she at least collect a change of clothes and check on her own place first, flanked the entire time by a quiet, watchful man named Torres, who never strayed more than 6 feet from her side. "This is excessive," Clara said, standing in her cramped kitchen while Torres checked the hallway outside her apartment for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "Mr. Rossi doesn't do things halfway," Torres said, not looking up from his phone. "Pack quickly. He wants you settled before midnight." Clara grabbed a duffel bag from her closet, stuffing it with clothes she barely registered choosing, her mind still tangled in everything Dominic had told her about Castellano, about her father, about the careful, methodical murder that might have been disguised as a tired heart giving out too soon. She was zipping the bag closed when the window in her bedroom shattered. The sound registered a half-second before understanding did, glass exploding inward across her carpet, followed immediately by Torres shouting something she couldn't process fast enough as he tackled her sideways, both of them crashing to the floor behind her bed frame. "Stay down," Torres barked, already pulling a weapon from beneath his jacket, his calm evaporating into sharp, focused urgency. Another shot cracked through the broken window, embedding into the wall above them, with a sound that Clara felt more than heard, a dull thud that sent plaster raining down onto her shoulders. "Someone's shooting at me," she said, her voice strangely calm even as her entire body shook. "Someone's shooting at both of us," Torres corrected, crawling toward the doorway, weapon raised. "Can you move?" "Yes." "Then move. Now. Stay low. Follow me exactly." Clara scrambled after him, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her throat, glass crunching beneath her palms as she crawled across her own bedroom floor like it belonged to someone else's nightmare rather than her actual apartment. They made it to the hallway when a second man appeared at the top of her stairwell, gun already raised. Torres fired first. The man crumpled against the wall, and Clara pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound, the reality of what had just happened. A man shot dead less than 10 feet from her, crashing over her in a wave of nausea she didn't have time to fully process. "Down the back stairs," Torres said, his voice clipped and urgent, hauling her upright by the arm. "Cars waiting on the street. Move." They descended 2 flights faster than Clara had ever moved in her life, Torres checking corners with the practiced efficiency of someone who had clearly done this before, though the tightness around his eyes suggested even he hadn't expected quite this level of aggression. The black sedan waiting at the curb had its engine already running, back door swinging open as they approached. Torres shoved Clara inside first, sliding in beside her and slamming the door as the car peeled away from the curb with a screech that echoed down the empty street. "Report," the driver said, eyes fixed on the road. "2 shooters, 1 down," Torres said, still breathing hard. They knew exactly which apartment. This wasn't a random hit. Clara sat frozen between them, her hands shaking uncontrollably now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline giving way to something closer to shock. "How did they know where I lived?" "That's an excellent question," Torres said grimly, pulling out his phone. "One Mr. Rossi is going to want answered immediately." The phone connected after 1 ring. "We have a situation," Torres said without preamble. 2 shooters at Miss Hayes's apartment. Professional. Targeted. Knew the exact address. We're clear. En route to the penthouse now." Clara couldn't hear Dominic's response, but she watched Torres's jaw tighten further, his knuckles whitening slightly around the phone. "Understood," Torres said finally, ending the call. "What did he say?" Clara asked. "He said only 4 people had access to your address on file. Myself, his personal assistant, his head of security, and Anthony Castellano. The name settled over Clara like ice water, confirming everything she'd feared since the window shattered. Castellano knows I exist. It appears he does now, Torres said. Which means, whatever theory you and Mr. Rossi were working through this afternoon just became considerably more urgent. The car sped through the city streets, and Clara stared out the window at buildings blurring past, trying to process the fact that she had nearly died in her own bedroom less than an hour after learning her father might have been murdered. She thought about calling Ruthie, warning her that something dangerous had followed Clara into her ordinary life. But Torres had already confiscated her phone the moment they'd cleared the apartment, insisting it wasn't safe until they could verify it hadn't been compromised somehow. I need to know, she said quietly, if this is going to keep happening. Torres glanced at her, something almost sympathetic crossing his usually stoic expression. Mr. Rossi doesn't lose people he's decided to protect. Miss Hayes, whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone anymore. Clara wanted to find comfort in that promise, but all she could think about was the man who had crumpled against her stairwell wall, the sound of gunfire that had shattered not just her window, but every remaining illusion that she could simply walk away from what she'd discovered. There was no walking away now, not with Castellano aware of her existence, not with two men already dead in the span of a single terrifying hour. She was in this completely, whether she'd chosen it or not. Dominic was waiting when the elevator doors opened onto the penthouse floor, his usual careful composure stripped away entirely, replaced by something sharp and dangerous that made Torres straighten instinctively beside her. "Report," Dominic said, though his eyes were fixed on Clara, scanning her for injuries with an intensity that felt almost physical. "Two shooters, professional grade, knew the exact apartment," Torres said. "One neutralized, the other escaped before backup arrived. Miss Hayes is unharmed." "Unharmed," Dominic repeated, though something in his tone suggested he didn't fully believe it until he'd confirmed it himself, closing the distance between them and taking her face in his hands with a gentleness that startled her, tilting her chin up to study her eyes, her face, checking for damage that Torres's assurance apparently hadn't sufficiently addressed. "I'm fine," Clara said, though her voice wavered slightly, the adrenaline finally beginning to crash now that immediate danger had passed. "Shaken, not hurt." "You could have died," Dominic said, his voice low and rough, carrying an intensity that had nothing to do with careful business calculation. "In your own bedroom, because someone connected to my organization decided you'd become a liability worth eliminating." "I gathered that much myself," Clara said, some of her natural bluntness returning despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. "Given the bullet holes in my apartment." Something flickered across Dominic's face, almost a smile despite the grim circumstances. "You're remarkably composed for someone who was nearly killed an hour ago." "I'm remarkably good at falling apart later, in private, when it's more convenient," Clara said. "Right now, I'd prefer to understand what happens next." Dominic studied her for a long moment, then released her face and stepped back, though his eyes remained fixed on her with an unwavering attention that made her skin feel warm, despite the chill still lingering from her narrow escape. "What happens next," he said, "is that you don't leave this penthouse without protection. Not for work, not for errands, not for anything, until Castellano is neutralized entirely." "I can't just disappear from my life, Dominic." "Your life nearly ended tonight," Dominic said, his voice sharpening. "I'm not negotiating this point, Clara." The use of her first name, rather than the careful formality he'd maintained since their first conversation that afternoon, sent an unexpected shiver through her, though she couldn't quite parse whether it stemmed from comfort or something else entirely. "Fine," she said finally, exhaustion winning out over her instinct to argue further. "But I want to help. Whatever you're planning to do about Castellano, I want to be part of it." "Absolutely not." "You said yourself I noticed things," Clara pressed. "Things your people missed for 12 years. That has to be worth something." It's worth quite a lot, Dominic said, which is exactly why I'm not putting you anywhere near additional danger, simply to satisfy your curiosity. This isn't curiosity, Clara said, her voice cracking slightly for the first time since the shooting. This is my father. If Castellano really did have something to do with his death, I need to see this through. I can't just hide in a penthouse while you handle everything and hope you'll tell me the truth eventually. Dominic's expression softened fractionally, something complicated moving behind his sharp eyes. I understand wanting answers about your father, but there's a difference between wanting justice and putting yourself directly in the path of men who've already tried to kill you once tonight. Then let me help from somewhere safer, Clara said. Whatever that looks like, I'm not asking to walk into a warehouse and confront him myself. I'm asking not to be shut out of something that matters this much to me. The tension between them stretched taut, neither willing to fully concede, until Torres cleared his throat quietly from where he'd remained near the elevator, clearly uncomfortable witnessing whatever this had become. I'll take first watch outside her room, Torres said, providing both of them a graceful exit from the standoff. You two can finish this conversation, but Miss Hayes should probably eat something and rest before either of you makes any decisions. Dominic exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Torres is right. You've had an impossible day. That's an understatement. There's a guest suite down the hall, Dominic said, gesturing toward a hallway lined with the same expensive, minimalist art she'd noticed in his office. Fully stocked, private security posted at every entrance to this floor. Nobody reaches you without going through people I trust completely. And tomorrow? Clara asked. We actually discuss letting me help? Tomorrow, Dominic said, something almost like reluctant respect crossing his features. We discuss it. Tonight, you rest. He walked her toward the guest suite himself, Torres trailing several steps behind, and when they reached the door, Dominic paused, his hand lingering near the frame, like he wasn't quite ready to leave her alone, despite everything that had already been arranged for her safety. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm glad the shot missed. Me too, Clara said, managing a weak, exhausted smile. Though I'm going to need new curtains. Something that might have been a real laugh escaped him. Quick and surprised, gone almost as soon as it appeared. I'll add it to the list of things I owe you. He left her standing in the doorway of an unfamiliar guest suite, in a penthouse belonging to a man she'd known for less than 24 hours, carrying the weight of her father's possible murder, and the very real knowledge that someone powerful enough to orchestrate a professional hit wanted her dead. Clara closed the door, sank onto the edge of the unfamiliar bed, and finally allowed herself to shake. 3 days passed before Clara found the pattern that would end everything. She sat cross-legged on the guest suite bed, surrounded by copies of the documents Dominic had reluctantly allowed her to review, insisting she remain confined to the penthouse while his men worked to locate Castellano, who had conveniently vanished the same night the shooters targeted her apartment. You're not finding anything new, Dominic said, appearing in her doorway with 2 cups of coffee, an offering that had become something of a ritual over the past 3 days. My analysts have been through every page a dozen times. Your analysts weren't looking for the right thing, Clara said, not looking up from the financial ledger spread across the comforter. They were looking for evidence of the leak. I'm looking for evidence of where he'd run. Dominic settled into the chair beside the bed, handing her a cup. And you've found something. Maybe. Clara flipped back several pages, tracing her finger down a column of dates. Castellano's been laundering money through a series of shell companies for years. Real estate holdings mostly. Small properties that never draw much attention. But look at this pattern. She turned the ledger toward him, pointing to a cluster of transactions from 18 months earlier. A property purchased near the coast, paid in cash through one of his shell companies. Small fishing cottage, nothing flashy. But the maintenance payments continue monthly. Even now, even after he supposedly disappeared. Dominic studied the entry, his expression sharpening. He's been paying to maintain a property nobody's supposed to know he owns. A place to run to, Clara said. Somewhere quiet, off the radar. Close enough to the water that he could disappear entirely if things went badly enough. I'd bet everything I have that's exactly where he's hiding right now. Dominic set down his coffee, already reaching for his phone. If you're right, this changes everything. There's more, Clara said, flipping to another section of documents. The Thursday pattern I noticed before, it's not just about shipment schedules. Look at the timing against Marchetti's known movements. Castellano wasn't just leaking information passively. He was actively coordinating interception points, telling Marchetti's people exactly which shipments to hit and when, timed specifically to make it look like bad luck rather than betrayal. You're certain of this? I've spent 3 days doing nothing but reading these files, Clara said dryly. I could probably recite half of them from memory at this point. Dominic looked at her with an expression Clara hadn't quite seen from him before, something between astonishment and genuine admiration. Torres said you were sharp. I don't think he fully captured it. I wait tables for a living, Dominic. You learn to read patterns fast when your tips depend on knowing which customers are about to complain before they open their mouths. This is somewhat more significant than reading difficult customers. The skill's the same, Clara said. Notice everything. Assume nothing. Trust the details more than the story people want you to believe. Dominic made the call immediately, dispatching Torres and 2 other men toward the coastal property Clara had identified, his voice carrying the same cold precision she'd witnessed in their first meeting, though something warmer lingered beneath it now, when his eyes returned to her. If you're right about this, he said after ending the call, we'll have him within the hour. And if I'm wrong? Then we've lost nothing but a few hours and confirmed one less possibility, Dominic said. Either way, you've contributed more to solving this than anyone on my payroll has managed in 3 days of searching. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest at the acknowledgement, unfamiliar after years of quietly excellent work going largely unnoticed at Ruthie's diner. I told you I noticed things. You did, Dominic said. I should have listened more carefully the first time. The call came 40 minutes later. Clara watched Dominic's face as he answered, tension coiling through her own body as she waited for confirmation. Confirmed, Torres's voice crackled through the speaker. Castellano's here. He's not alone, but we have him surrounded. No casualties on our end. Dominic exhaled slowly, some of the tightness leaving his shoulders. Bring him in. I want him processed properly. Documentation? Formal confession if you can manage it. Everything recorded and secured before anything else happens to him. Understood. When the call ended, Dominic turned to Clara with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something raw and grateful beneath his usual careful control. You just solved a problem that's been eating away at my organization for over a year, he said quietly. You found him when a dozen trained professionals couldn't. I got lucky. You got observant, Dominic corrected. There's a considerable difference, and I think you know that. Clara looked down at the documents scattered across the bed, at the careful trail of evidence she'd untangled through nothing more than pattern recognition and stubborn determination. What happens now? With Castellano? Now, Dominic said, his voice hardening slightly. He answers for everything, including, if what we suspect is accurate, whatever happened to your father 8 years ago. Clara's breath caught. After 8 years of unanswered questions, of grief tangled with suspicion she'd never quite been able to name, the possibility of actual answers felt almost too overwhelming to fully process. I want to be there, she said. When you question him. Dominic studied her for a long moment, something protective and reluctant warring behind his sharp eyes. That's not a good idea, Clara. Neither was opening your briefcase, Clara said. But here we are anyway. Anthony Castellano sat in a chair in the basement level of Dominic's building, hands cuffed, his silver hair disheveled, the careful composure of a man who had spent 12 years managing other people's secrets completely stripped away. Clara stood beside Dominic, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, watching the man who had orchestrated her father's death finally face consequences, 8 years in the making. You have nothing, Castellano said, though his voice lacked the conviction of true confidence. Whatever theories you've constructed, whatever this waitress helped you piece together, none of it will hold up anywhere that matters. I don't need it to hold up in court, Dominic said, his voice quiet and absolutely lethal. I need it to hold up to me. Dominic, we've worked together for 12 years. You murdered Robert Hayes, Dominic said, cutting him off, because he discovered your arrangement with Marchetti and refused to look away. Then you spent 8 years feeding intelligence to the very organization I've dedicated my life to eliminating from this city. Castellano's eyes flicked to Clara, recognition and something like genuine fear crossing his face for the first time. You're his daughter. Clara Hayes, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, standing tall despite every instinct urging her to shrink away from this man's presence. You stood at the back of his funeral. I remember you now. It wasn't personal, Castellano said, something desperate creeping into his tone. Your father was going to expose the entire operation. I had no choice. You had every choice, Clara said, something fierce rising in her chest that surprised even herself. You chose money and power over an honest man's life, and then you had the audacity to attend his funeral, like you had any right to grieve what you'd taken. The room fell silent, Castellano's carefully maintained facade finally crumbling entirely under the weight of 8 years of buried guilt, suddenly dragged into the light. I'll need everything, Dominic said. Every name, every account, every piece of the operation you've been running with Marchetti. In exchange, I'll ensure your death is quick rather than what you actually deserve. Castellano's face went pale, but he nodded slowly, understanding exactly what kind of mercy was being offered and exactly how limited it truly was. 2 hours later, when the confession had been extracted and recorded, when the full scope of Castellano's betrayal had been documented in exhaustive detail, Dominic finally led Clara back upstairs, away from the basement and everything it represented. It's over, he said, once they'd reached the privacy of his office, the same room where this entire impossible journey had begun less than a week earlier. Is it? Clara asked. Marchetti's still out there. Marchetti's operation just lost its inside access to my organization, Dominic said. Without Castellano feeding him information, he's considerably more vulnerable than he's been in years. That battle isn't finished, but tonight, your father's killer faced justice. That part, at least, is complete. Clara sank into the chair across from his desk, the same chair she'd occupied that first terrifying afternoon, though everything about how she sat in it now felt entirely different, steadier, more certain of her place in this room, and in whatever came next. Thank you, she said quietly. You did this, Dominic said, rounding the desk to stand closer to her. I simply had the resources to act on what you discovered. We did this, Clara corrected, echoing words she'd heard somewhere similar not long ago, though the sentiment felt entirely her own now. Together, Dominic studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded finally breaking through the careful control he'd maintained since their very first meeting at Ruthie's diner. I owe you considerably more than gratitude, Clara Hayes. You could start by not making me sleep in a guest suite indefinitely, Clara said, some of her natural dry humor returning now that the immediate danger had passed. Though I suppose I should ask what happens to my actual apartment, the one with bullet holes. Already being repaired, Dominic said, though I'd prefer you consider somewhere more permanent than a roadside diner's waitress apartment. Are you offering me a job, Mr. Rossi? I'm offering you considerably more than that, Dominic said, moving closer, close enough that Clara had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. You walked into my world by accident, returned something you had every reason to keep, and then proceeded to solve a problem that had eluded my entire organization for over a year. I don't intend to simply thank you and send you back to waiting tables like none of this happened. Then what exactly are you proposing? That you stay, Dominic said simply, not as an employee, not as someone I'm protecting out of obligation, As someone whose mind I've come to value more than almost anyone else in my organization. As someone I find myself considerably more interested in than I have any right to be, given the circumstances that brought us together. Clara's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice, so different from the careful, calculating man she'd first encountered across this same desk. That's a significant leap from returning a briefcase. Life tends to change quickly around dangerous men, Dominic said, something almost like humor, threading through his voice now. You seem to handle that particular lesson remarkably well. I had good motivation, Clara said, echoing words she'd spoken once before to a different, gentler man in a different office, though the sentiment felt equally true here. Surviving tends to sharpen certain skills. Dominic reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers, careful and deliberate, in a way that made her pulse quicken, despite everything they'd both survived to reach this moment. Stay, he said again, quieter now. Not because you owe me anything, because I've spent the last week discovering that the world looks considerably different, with you paying attention to it. Clara looked up at him, at the man who had tested her, protected her, and ultimately chosen her over every careful calculation he'd built his empire around, and felt something settle deep in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with finally, completely, being seen. All right, she said softly. I'll stay. Outside the office windows, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware that a waitress who had spent years perfecting the art of blending into the background had just stepped fully and permanently into the light. Clara Hayes had returned a briefcase out of nothing more than basic decency. She never could have imagined it would give her back everything she'd lost and offer her a future she'd never dared to want.